This time of year is, we're in already. There's a festival season this time of year, and for the next couple of months or so more. And every year it comes, and as part of festival season, we find that this topic that we're going to speak about a little bit today, it comes up again and again. It's something that's, you might say, critical or fundamental in festival season, and that's yajna, sacrifice, offering of ourselves. And of course we know, we're taught in our teachings that when we speak about sacrifice, what we're speaking about, yes, there's outward sacrifice and there's outward offering and the putting aside of one thing for something higher. But we know that this is symbolic, and it's an important symbolism to keep in mind. And I think for the devotee, particularly those of us who are disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda, this path of self-realization, we understand this, but it's good to keep it in mind that as important and vital, of course, as that outward offering of that we do, it reminds us really of what it is really. Offering and sacrifice is something that's inside, and that we need to, you could say, as a devotee, we should live a life of sacrifice. And this is what the scriptures actually say. Life is sacrifice. Now, when we hear those words, we think, oh no. It sounds a little bit formidable. But if we understand it rightly, it's not. Life is sacrifice, and it's putting aside one thing for something higher. And really, sacrifice on the day-to-day is an act of self-offering. We do arati, of course, and what are we doing? Symbolically, we're offering. Pujas, we're offering. And of course, coming back, we make that offering, and that afterwards we make the offerings and we have prasad. Well, these are all very symbolic. Well, obviously, when we make an offering of any kind like that, it's a representation of our very selves, ultimately our ego itself, all of our faults, all of this body, this spirit, this habits, the senses. We're giving it all to you, God, to be purified. And in return, what do we do after we have our arati every week? We have prasad. Well, this prasad, what is that? Really, prasad is representative. It's an image of God's grace. We receive God's grace. We offer ourselves, and God's grace comes back to us. And that prasad represents God's grace. And our taking that prasad is accepting and receiving that grace of God. But when we think of sacrifice and we think of offering like this, we often separate the two a little bit. I'm going to offer something, I'm going to sacrifice something, and then after I do that, God's going to bless me. You see, and that I give, and if I give, then I'll get blessed. Now that's true. There's a certain truth to that. And of course, this is how people approach spirituality and ritual and religion, and I give and then God will give back to me. But there's a deeper side to this. And we have to remember the deeper side, I think, in this. And I want to talk a little bit about this. It's in the sacrifice itself that we receive the blessing. It's not you sacrifice and then It's not like that. It's in the act of sacrifice that grace comes, you see. So when we say that don't we say that we want to live a life in grace? We want to live in God's grace. But we also say, that the scriptures say, the saints say, we need to live, life is sacrifice. But in the same, that's another way of saying life is grace. In the sacrifice, there is the grace. And it's in the giving that we receive, you see. And it's all one. In the giving of ourselves, the giving of our energy, the giving of our thoughts, the giving of whatever it is, of our very selves, in that very act, we receive. And it comes back to us. And this is to keep in mind, because that idea of sacrifice, of, oh, I'm giving up something. Oh, but I guess it's for my own good. God will reward me. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. That's a lower understanding of it. And of course, as Swami would often say, and he says the Vedas were very wise, because they taught us many different things of how to properly make offering, how to properly sacrifice in all different levels for people of all different levels of understanding, depending upon their level of understanding. But if they understand on a low level, that's good. It's not to be criticized, because it teaches us to ask for God and to relate to God. God will give us blessings, and to bring God into our lives and ask for God's blessings. And yes, I will do so many of this or that actions, and I'll make a bargain with you, God. If I do this, you'll give me that. Now, that's a little bit of a merchant approach, but it's not to be criticized. It's to be transcended with something higher, because that gets us started. And I think all of us sort of do that. In times when times are tough, we tend to pray to God in order to help us to get over those tough times. But yet, a deeper understanding is to live always in that state of grace, always in a state of self-offering. And then grace begins to flow. And that's what a life of sacrifice is. And we want to live such a life. So that took me a little longer I was going to read this a little sooner, but this is from chapter 4. Now, it starts off by eating the blessed food left from any of these spiritual fire rituals, one attains to Brahman. Now, I kind of went on to Google just to see what somebody in Google would say about this reading on the Gita. And I said Gita, and I picked a Gita, and the fellow started expounding on the Gita on that. And he started talking about vegetarianism. And I said, what the Gita is saying here is we should be vegetarians. And I thought, wait a minute, that's... But you see, maybe he was right, actually. I shouldn't criticize, because these things are on all different levels. But Master tells us there's a deeper level to this. And so he says, by eating the blessed food, the prasad, left from any of these spiritual fire rituals, one attains to Brahman. Even the blessings of this world come not to one who gives nothing of himself. How then can one hope for happiness in a better world? And I think that's the point I'm making here, is even the blessings of this world come not to one who gives nothing of himself. And the blessings we seek in life, the good things, the pleasant things, the happy things, the good experience, prosperity, they don't come unless we give something of ourselves. And of course, the lower understanding is, well, I want Bharat to give me something, so I'll give him a coin and he'll give me something back. But no, it's in the giving of oneself that the blessings, and this is our approach, how we have to make our approach to life. I think you all remember the story from the autobiography of Yogi of Baduri Mahashai, where he's the sleepless saint. No. Was he right? He's that fellow that lives around the corner from. Okay, that was right. The sleepless saint, right? Is that right? Levitating saint. No, you're right, because the sleepless saint was the other Ramgopal Mazumdar. No, the levitating saint. So which, by the way, you can go to his house in Calcutta. It's right there around the corner from Master's house. And he mentions there Oh, or his disciples say to him, "Oh, sir, you're such a great soul." And because he had been a wealthy man as a young man, he says, "You have given everything away to follow the spiritual life that you've taken up." And he gave his riches away. And you sacrifice so much, the implication being there. And he basically laughed when Yoganandaji, as Mukunda, said that. He said, "No, it's the others who have been the renunciates. They renounced the kingdom, an inner kingdom, for a few paltry rupees." In other words, in seeking their wealth outside, they sacrificed the inner life. And he said, he sacrificed that, but look what he had in return. I have a kingdom of God's presence within me so where was the sacrifice, in other words? There was no sacrifice. And I think this is something we need to remember when we think about this term sacrifice, and of giving of ourselves, whether renunciation, a giving of something away in order to achieve something higher. It's often made out or expressed in a way as if somehow, oh, you've sacrificed all of this in order to find God. Well, a true saint didn't sacrifice anything. He just put it aside and gained something much, much more. Now, sometimes this came to mind is because, you've had a number of people come and tell you about this 50th celebration. So I'm not telling you it again because you probably had 3 or 4 of these sharing episodes. But I was asked to speak there at one of the events. And I thought about it ahead of time, and I wanted to give a certain talk, but I didn't give the talk because there wasn't time really to me to go, and it wasn't appropriate for the occasion. So I gave a different talk, but I wanted to say certain things, which maybe I can share. But at this event, and because my job was to talk about the beginning of Ananda Sangha at Ananda Village, so I had to stick to that topic, and so I did, and and I told some stories, and my co-speakers also told some stories from those times, and it was very simple. Our work there was very simple, primitive even, you might say, on the material plane. And you would hear people sometimes when we tell those stories, they'd say, "Oh gosh, you sacrifice so much." And, to do that, to go out there in the countryside, there was no houses, no nothing, and to endure that, and as if there was a hardship or something like that. And when somebody says that to me, which they do from time to time, if they're talking about those days, I have to be polite. Obviously, it's not proper for me to say otherwise. But realize, if you ever say that to me in my mind, I'm saying, that's nonsense. I didn't sacrifice anything. I had the time of my life. I was having the most fun that I've ever had in my life. So where was the sacrifice? And in the sense, but there's a principle here. Swami Kriyananda used to say, and it was a saying he probably got, I can't remember where it came from, it was one Catholic saint, I think, said this. He said, "A sad saint is a sad saint indeed." In other words, if there's somebody who's spiritual and they're talking about, oh, it was so hard, and we had to do this, and I slept on a hard bed, and I had to get up and pray every morning, and is that what a saint is going to say? Of course not. And so if you hear people complaining about their spiritual life, how difficult it all was, well, obviously they're giving a little something too much away about themselves. There's no joy there. True sacrifice is joyful. Sacrifice in the way that we're speaking about it, in the receiving of divine grace through that, because you don't receive divine grace if you're not joyful. And so when we quote-unquote sacrifice, even in the outward way of ritual or whatever we do, it needs to be able to receive that prasad in the true sense of grace, we need to offer ourselves in a joyful way, joyful offering of self up to God. And in that joyfulness, we automatically attract and draw grace to us at that very time. And so consequently, we find that, and to expand this beyond the spiritual realm, we find that living a life dedicated to some high principle, let's take it that way rather than the spiritual sense, to live a life dedicated to high principle is not a sacrifice if it's approached properly. If you're not enjoying your life and you're trying to live a life toward high principles, something is off. If you're complaining, you're saying how hard it is, you've missed something, some essential ingredient. So we need to, as individuals, I hope we're all living for very high principles. I think we are. We wouldn't be here if we weren't. I know when I was a young man, when you're young, in this case, I was a teenager and then in my 20s, I think most young people have ideals. They're idealistic. Sometimes and parents say, tamp them down a little bit for their idealism. But young people, that's their nature. They're idealistic. And they grow up and eventually they end up, of course, having to moderate that sometimes. And as Master would say, you have to learn to be practical in your idealism. But being practical does not mean compromising your ideals. It means learning to, or sacrificing your ideals. It doesn't mean sacrificing your ideals to be practical. It means learning to live in the world for your ideals. And so you have to putting those ideals into real practice. That's a very different thing. Well, young people growing up, and I was young growing up, and that's what brought me to Ananda Village. But when you're living for principles, as oftentimes young people are, you find that there's enthusiasm. Think of the lover who will do anything, cross mountains, go over streams in order to please and be with his beloved. He's not thinking, oh, that beloved, she lives. Why'd you go over there? He'll do anything. He's going to go. He's going to do he's going to climb that mountain if that's what it takes. And he's not bemoaning that. And so if you hear somebody bemoaning the difficulties of spiritual life, look in the mirror, and if you're bemoaning, you've got a little something off, you see. Joyful. We have to bring joy to what we're doing. And of course, we all fail in this from time to the time because we know we can't, this is the spiritual life of learning to live in that state from day to day. And of course, I bemoan it as well as anybody, but I remind myself, wait a minute, you can't live like that. Because how are you going to sustain yourself? Now, the monks are doing a Kriya Yoga series of inspiring a lifetime of Kriya Yoga, I think is what they're calling this. And they've asked various speakers to speak to that topic. How do you maintain a lifetime of devotional aspiration? And this is one of them. You need to be enthusiastically approaching the sacrifices, the self-offerings, that what you have to do in a joyful spirit of offering oneself constantly. It's a lifetime thing. But in order for it to be a lifetime thing, to sacrifice always, we have to approach it with, it's not a pain, it's a gain. We are gaining something. I'm putting aside all of those things that are keeping me from my beloved. And I'm overcoming those, and I'm taking up the challenge. And if we approach life in that joyful expectancy and try to summon that up, then we find that grace begins to flow in the very act of that enthusiastic response, or that enthusiastic approach to life. We open the doors for grace to flow in us when we sacrifice. And what is sacrifice? It's putting aside the lower in order that we could have the higher. Or as Yogananda would say, putting aside the stale cheese so that you can enjoy the good cheese. And that's all it really is. But sometimes we long for that stale cheese, and we miss it. I liked it, and that's how life is. We miss those things. We're thinking that something is being taken away from God, the spiritual path, Divine Mother is taking away these things from us. But I think a good way to look at it is when we feel that outward sense of burden that maybe comes from sacrifice, you might think of yourself as being privileged, actually. Divine Mother is reaching down to, you could say, uplift you. That poem that the Master used to like, that was but the shade of your hand reaching down to me, that I thought that darkness was and I discovered it was but the shade of your hand reaching down to uplift and pull me up. And that's how it is. As when things come, difficulties come, things that we think in the traditional way of being sacrificing, I'm having to give this up, that up, it's really an opportunity. And if we see that there's really Divine Mother reaching out to lift us up, and if we can, in that thought, we find that, yes, we can be enthusiastic. And in that very act of enthusiasm and joyfulness, we open up the door for grace to flow into us. We don't have to wait. It's immediate to the degree, and you could say, because it's immediate, it's in our hands. We sometimes approach God with a pleading attitude. Maybe God's going to bless me, maybe not. I've got to do this just right. If I mess it up, I'm not going to get that blessing. That's not really at all. The blessings that can come to us are in our hands. It's in our control. Yes, you could say that maybe that sounds a little arrogant, but really it's not. God is there waiting at all times to give us her blessings to us. And it's us who is the lacking of being able to draw those blessings. And the way we approach life, the attitude with which we approach life, approach anything, is the key to whether that grace will begin to flow into us. So it's in our hands. And I think we combine that with the techniques that have been given to us by our gurus to do this on even subtler levels through our practice of Kriya Yoga. We open that up. So we very directly open it through the practice of our techniques, and secondly, through the attitude with which we approach those techniques and through what we do every day of our lives. The life of a Kriya Yogi is not just when we're doing technique. The life of a Kriya Yogi is every moment of the day. How do we approach life? And approach it as in an attitude of self-offering. God, I'm here, I offer myself on the altar of your presence. Come to me. And with a sincere heart, that blessing and that prayer will be fulfilled. So in that spirit, let's do arati and offer ourselves symbolically in this way. And then afterwards, we'll be able to receive the grace. So.